I'm Fran Burwell. I'm a vice president at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to have such a distinguished panel here today. I have, to my immediate right, Stanislaw Koziej. I hope I've not butchered that too much, who is the head of the National Security Bureau here in Poland. Yves from Paris and the Center for Strategic Research. Heinz Kamp from the NATO Defense College. And then over here I have Imants Liegis, a member of parliament in Latvia, former Minister of Defense, but his real expertise right now is he's a former perm rep, an ambassador to NATO and head of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly for his country. And Steve Larrabee from RAND, longtime analyst of these issues. So we're delighted to have all of them today. If you want to know more about them, it's in your packets. A number of us were in Lisbon in November 2010 when NATO agreed a new strategic concept. The concept was the result of many discussions within the alliance, both on the official level, and there was, of course, the committee of experts, co-chaired by Madeleine Albright, and I know Daniel Rotfeld was the Polish representative on that. And contrary to the concerns of some of us, NATO did actually manage to produce a readable document, and it actually looks very accessible when you see it in the little format like they have here. But the question is not really, is a strategic concept readable? It's really whether it's relevant. And so we're here today to kind of look at this 7 months on and say, how relevant is this strategic concept? Did it actually resolve some issues, or did it paper them over? I think, given where we are in Poland, the major issue to be discussed, as we heard this morning, it was very much highlighted by President Komorowski, was how credible is Article 5? How has the strategic concept and the agreements reached in Lisbon made it more credible or less credible? When we went into the summit, there seemed to be a lot of splits in the alliance about that and about the importance of that. So where are we now? But we also need to talk about the challenges that the alliance faces now and the resources that it is able to bring to bear. What does it mean in terms of nuclear weapons and the decisions on missile defense? Where is the alliance going in those areas? And then there's the obvious thing that has changed since November, and that is the involvement in Libya. What does this mean for the agreements that were made in Lisbon? Is this a distraction? Is it the way forward for the alliance? What do we know about that? Let me underscore that although we've kind of used the strategic concept as a kicking off point in this panel, it really is just a document. And what's really important is the institution which it represents, in this case, NATO. The concept represents a particular moment in time, November 2010, and the question now is, how is the alliance coping with the challenges that it has met since then? Did the decisions in Lisbon just paper over some differences, or was there a real resolution, and is the alliance moving forward? So let me start with Stanislaw Koziej. The Polish government was one of those that was strongest in pushing for reassurance about Article 5 in Lisbon. Are you happy? Are you satisfied? And what steps have been taken to reassure you about the credibility of Article 5? And what's the threat that you're so concerned about?
Rzeczywiście, Pani Przewodnicząca, Szanowni
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen,
Polska była i
Poland
jest cały
was and
czas
is all the
szczególnie
time very much
zainteresowana
interested in
utrzymywaniem
maintaining and credibility of our obligations to protect security based on Article 5. That results from at least two reasons. First reason is our historical experiences, and the second reason is our strategic position in NATO. this moment today. As regards our historical experiences, it is worth to remind that for a large portion of our history, the Polish nation had to exist without its state. We had no state at all. We were either under some imposition, or we had no will of our own. Almost 1/4 of our 4 centuries history were under these conditions. Even the 20th century, if we have a glance at the 20th century, only 30 years within this 100 years, which is 1/3, we can say that we've been operating as a fully independent state. So 20 years was of the 20th century. Poland was we had no state at all. For 50 years, we had no authorities as a state ourselves. So for these reasons and historical experiences, we know the price that we have to pay to take care about our own security. Our strategic position in NATO is also quite specific as relates to other members, because we are the city which is just on the verge of NATO. On the limits of NATO. So at least from this relation, we have to have a slightly different sensibility against possible attacks than many other NATO states. We've often been asked, and the chairman also asked slightly in this context, who are we afraid of? Who is the risk for us? Is Russia dangerous for us? No. Today, if we look at the strategic position today, nobody is a direct risk for us as regards a direct army attack. Neither Russia or any other country, neither neighboring nor any state, is not our. We don't regard anyone as our enemy, meaning somebody who intentionally is preparing to attack us, to be aggressive against Poland. But we all know that there are some objective sources of risk, of threat that may reveal in the future. Today, we don't have to be afraid of anyone, but let us think if by tomorrow we won't be attacked by anyone. We would probably answer, probably not, but within 1 year, can we be sure that we won't be attacked? Probably, probably yes, but if within 5 years we can be really sure that nobody would attack that, here we cannot have this certainty. What happens in the perspective of 10 or 20 years? We cannot anticipate anything. In one word, security has to be considered in a long-term perspective. We have to be prepared to protect your territory against any possible attacks. Any protective capabilities is not what can be bought on a marketplace. Tomorrow we'll need it, so I'll go and get it for myself. No, protection, security capabilities is like a very precious plant that has to be grown very carefully, to look after, to have it, to be sure that tomorrow and in the future we'll have some fresh flowers at our home. Therefore, I think that for these reasons, Poland was active, very active to place in this NATO conception this provisions concerning general protection, collective protection. Also, because it includes some mechanisms that allow for to have us hope that this inscription, this provision, won't be only an empty provision, invalid provision. It was also stated by President Komorowski today. But we can mention especially 2 mechanisms: contingency planning, any possible upcoming plans that can be developed. Another mechanism are army trainings and exercises. I want to highlight here the issue of army exercises. It relates to collective protection. There is no better mechanism to get prepared to reply to any attack than exercising and training. Words are meaningless even if they are encompassed in excellent articles and protection plans. If we are not able to improve them, implement them,
interesują sprawami
everybody who is
obrony
interested
wiedzą,
in
że praktycznie
security
jedyną
issues
metodą,
realize that the
realną
only
metodą
real
weryfikacji uwiarygodnienia
reliable
planów
method to verify
operacyjnych
plans,
to są
operational
ćwiczenia
plans,
wojskowe.
are
Więc
army
zapisy,
trainings.
jesteśmy
So
z tego zadowoleni,
provisions, we are very
natomiast,
happy about provisions.
jeśli chodzi o te ćwiczenia,
As
to nie mamy
regards
wielkiej
trainings,
pewności, bo
we
obserwujemy,
don't
że nie
have
wszyscy
this
tak
huge
chętnie
certainty
podchodzą,
because
aby
we see
takie
that not
ćwiczenia się
everybody is
odbywały.
that optimistic to hold these trainings.
Myślę, że pani
think
przewodnicząca
that
jeszcze wspomniała o obronie
you
przeciwrakietowej.
mentioned also anti-missile protection and
Obrona
shields.
przeciwrakietowa
So anti-missile shield and protection is also one important element of protection, direct protection for territory. Therefore, Poland is very much fluid. We are supporting the idea to develop this protection system of NATO. Although I think that this anti-missile protection has much wider sense than only collective protection itself, because it is one of the very important tools to react to relatively new challenges that emerge in the present environment, such as asymmetric nuclear and missile risks created by some problematic countries. And I think a majority of experts agree that in quite close future it may be used also by non-state entities. Therefore, these non-state entities can apply some sort of blackmail in the future. Anti-missile shield is a good tool, but not the only one. It can respond quite well to these challenges that we have to tackle today.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn a little bit north to Latvia and Imants Liegis. And the Baltics were also very active in seeking greater reassurance about Article 5. And I remember you visiting Washington at one point and being very frank on this point. 7 months after Lisbon, are you satisfied? What specific steps do you see that have been taken that have enhanced Article 5's credibility, if any? And I know Latvia, although it's got a very small military force, has been active in Afghanistan, while NATO has taken on some other roles, such as air defense, in providing for your own security. How do you balance that in terms of Article 5 versus the resources that it takes to go farther afield?
Thanks very much, Fran. First of all, can I say that it's a great pleasure
Przede wszystkim
to be here in Wroclaw. And I've visited Poland during the last year on three or four occasions, and when I spoke to our ambassador in Warsaw about the perception from Warsaw of Latvia, the reply was, well, yes, it's a country the other side of Lithuania. But it's also true that for Latvia, Poland is extremely important regionally. Your question about are we satisfied with the developments vis-à-vis Article 5 strategic concept, I would say that in parallel to both the discussions and the adoption of the strategic concept and the Lisbon summit, there were developments that were very positive for Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. And I remember very well that there were concerns about the new administration taking over in Washington at the beginning of 2009, if I remember correctly, and then we had the first summit that President Obama attended, where he, both in his speech in Karl, Strasbourg, and also afterwards in Prague, referred to the necessity for all countries to have contingency planning. And this relates to Article 5, of course, because unlike Poland, Latvia was not in the position back then of having these plans within the alliance. And if we now look a couple of years down the line, we do have these plans, and again, the planning from NATO for our region is linked to Poland, so it's a Polish-Baltic region. So this is very positive. And this is something that, of course, Stanislaw mentioned about the need for having these plans, but not only having the plans, but also having the exercises. And I will be even more specific on what Stanislaw said concerning exercises, because prior to the Warsaw summit of the presidents a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a little blog, and the heading was, "What should President Zattler say to President Obama?" And one of the things that, and this was as a result of a discussion we were having in Riga concerning the reset, and is Latvia satisfied with the reset? And it also relates to a question put by 4 senators that were visiting Riga, and they asked, well, are you satisfied with the reset? These were 4 Republican senators, so I had to disappoint them and say, yes, that we were very satisfied because of the fact that, we do have, since the Obama administration came into power, we do have these plans. But the message that I said that our president, or one of the things that I said our president should ask of President Obama, is that the planned exercises due to take place in Poland in 2013 should go ahead. We need reassurances that they should go ahead. I don't know what the current position is in Brussels vis-à-vis these exercises, but these are very important exercises. They are referred to as Article 5 exercises. So it is important that we have the plans, that we have exercises. There have been, during the time that I was Minister of Defence, there have been very important exercises by the alliance that took place in Latvian territory. And these were regional exercises, once again, because our defence in Latvia is interlinked with very much with Estonia and Lithuania, and we regard ourselves as being one unit. We don't have a problem with that. And as Fran, you mentioned, this is particularly the case with the question of the air policing of NATO airspace in the Baltics, where we do rely on the solidarity and partnerships of allies within the alliance, because we were advised prior to joining NATO in 2004 that it would not be sensible for our countries to lay out extraordinary sums of money to buy F-16s, other airplanes that could deal with this air policing. So as a result, there was a joint decision by the alliance to take on the responsibility. But what does that mean in practice? It means that, yes, we don't have all of the capabilities that are necessary for the individual defence of our countries, but this is where the pooling of resources is extremely important. And I think that the model of air policing in our countries and the way in which it's dealt with by way of solidarity by members of the alliance is an example, especially in challenging economic times, of how the alliance can deal with the joint issues related to collective defence that are out there at the moment. And in some ways, we have been faced with a problem even during the last few months. Well, do you feel that because of the operations that are taking place at the moment, Afghanistan and Libya, that the question of collective defence is really being pushed aside? And Latvia's answer to that is no, because at the moment we, even though there is heavy French engagement in Libya, we currently have French aeroplanes policing the skies over Latvia. So it's clear that the alliance is able to handle these problems. The alliance for us is extremely relevant. Article 5, I was in Bulgaria a couple of weeks ago at the NATO parliamentary session in Varna, and the foreign minister was giving an address about the strategic concept. And what was very interesting, in his address, he didn't refer once to collective defence or Article 5. So that also shows that regionally the question is looked at in different ways. For us, it is relevant, and we feel that the issues are being adequately dealt with by the alliance as a whole.
Thank you very much. Let me turn now away from the edge of Europe, so to speak, but turn to Karl-Heinz Kamp. Do you think that NATO is on firmer ground now in terms of Article 5 than it was before Lisbon? And can you say how you think NATO's relationship with Russia relates to all this? We heard Stanislaw Koziej say that it wasn't Russia that was a threat. It was something undefined 5-10 years from now that one needs to be prepared for. The current Secretary General has made improved relations with Russia kind of a keystone of his time. So how does that get squared with this increased attention to Article 5 and reassurance? And what impact do you think the operations on Afghanistan and Libya will have on the ability of NATO to provide? We've heard now that we have French planes both in Libya and in the Baltics, but overall there are not that many French planes. So if you could speak on some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fran. Before this session, we were all told by Fran that we have about 5 minutes to answer. And I was asking Fran, how shall I manage to say everything I know within 5 minutes? And she said, you can speak very, very slowly. So this is what I'm going to do. If you ask an academic, you never get a clear answer. So it's also my answer is a yes and no. And I would propose, on the question, is NATO better off? I would propose 3 yeses and 1 no. The first yes is quite simple, because Article 5 is now firmly emphasized, has been firmly emphasized in the strategic concept, and this was something the new NATO members reminded the old ones that this is the reason, this was the very reason why they wanted to join NATO at the first place. And the old members got this. And this is why the entire debate on Article 5 was much less forceful as we had expected, either in the Albright group or at the end in the strategic concept. It helped a lot that, in my view, I believe, we have a general trend, we had in the last 2 or 3 years, a general trend in NATO towards emphasizing its core mission, self-defense anyway. Not because Afghanistan is wrong, but because Afghanistan showed us what the limits of military force are and how few you can achieve at the end of the day after 10 years with so much money and with so much blood and treasure. So that's the first yes. The second yes has already been mentioned. NATO bolstered this declaration by a number of concrete measures, the famous contingency plans, the exercises, missile defense, although it is not a direct Article 5 issue, but it belongs to this. However, missile defense, be aware that missile defense is not a panacea. It is not a silver bullet. Missile defense is at best sort of a third line of defense. If it's true that the first line of defense is always diplomacy and arms control, not to have certain threats emerge at the first place, and if this line of defense fails, you always have the deterrence line of defense, and if this fails for whatever reason also, you have the third line of defense, which is defense in that kind, this missile defense. Not more and not less, so it is not a panacea for all NATO problems. We have another part, some kind like an implementation of this, and that's the nuclear issue. Nuclear has been completely exotic for many, many years. In the meantime, NATO has tackled or is in the process of tackling the core nuclear question, which is how to deter whom with what. We don't have an agreement on this. We never had. We basically papered over these problems. NATO has now a new process. You might have which you might have heard about, the Deterrence Defense Posture Review. What I'm saying is NATO has not solved all these problems, but it's in the process of doing so. Third, yes, is Russia. We have tackled the old question, what the hell is the relationship between Article 5 and Russia? And one of the key insights of this entire strategic concept process was that reassurance from Russia and cooperation with Russia is not a contradiction. Only if all 28 countries feel reassured, true cooperation is possible. And the point is that Russia can and has to contribute to this. If there are threat perceptions in certain regions, then Russia can contribute to create a climate not to have these certain threat perceptions. And exercises in the Baltics doesn't contribute to this process of weakening the threat perceptions. So yes, the problem is Russia is not always as user-friendly as we would like it to be. I have one no in this entire thing, which is not directly related to the Article 5. But Article 5 is a lot about solidarity. Solidarity of particularly the old members to the new NATO members, simply because the new ones are living in a certain geographical and historical connotation. But solidarity also has to hold true for the other tasks of NATO. And we have an operation in Libya. In Libya, 33 countries are involved. 8 countries do the dirty job there. Not a single one of the new NATO members is part of these 8. Now, I'm not requesting that small countries should do something they cannot do. Of course, the Baltics cannot contribute. They can contribute an air force they don't have. But the basic logic should take a larger ground in NATO that if you expect solidarity, you have to give it in another place. I know that I'm the last person to say so because I'm a German. So this is why I just put on my NATO hat and not my German hat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yves, I'd like to bring you in, and I guess we're actually moving kind of to the west. What do you see from your perch in Paris? Are there any direct threats against the alliance? Has this whole debate about reassurance been overblown a bit? What are the threats that actually face the alliance today, and is Article 5 and NATO relevant to that? And Karl Heinz mentioned the new Deterrence and Defense Review. How do missile defense and the persistence of nuclear weapons within NATO, how do those respond to the threats that you see?
I will not deal with the threat, but I will first mention challenges ahead of us. And challenges are not so much outside NATO, they are within NATO. I will explain what I mean by that. If we look at the consequences of the economic and financial crisis, so those challenges are the following, to my understanding. In the US, the federal deficit is now of the same amount of the GDP of the European Union, and it cannot last very long. And the way the US will deal with this issue will in fact affect their military apparatus and the way they deploy forces abroad. And we have been warned by Secretary of Defense Gates that the deployment of US forces in Europe are oversized due to the fact there is no longer threat in Europe. So in fact it will affect those issues of US federal deficit. It will affect how we will perceive defense in Europe. It probably will affect also in the near future the way and the understanding of what could be a BMD system deployed in Europe. But these kind of challenges are also our challenges in the European Union as member of NATO. In fact, today the European Union is going through a very deep existential crisis, largely linked to the fate of the euro. And as far as this crisis is not overcome, it will mean that the Europeans will not draw their attention to defense issue. But at the same time, we in Europe are facing growing instability from an arc of crisis spreading from West Africa to the Indian Ocean. And there, I want to draw your attention about the Arab Spring. We were told this morning that it is a wonderful thing. In a way, this is a wonderful thing, but we don't know yet the result of the Arab Spring. We just look at what is happening in Tunisia or Egypt. In Tunisia, to give you some element, we see that growingly in many mosques, if not most mosques in Tunisia, moderate imams are replaced by fundamentalists. This is a sign. Ennahda movement in Tunisia is on the rise. The same in Egypt with the Muslim Brothers. So I think we need to be very careful of what will happen in the Maghreb and Mashrek. And Arab Springs for democracy does not mean a result that will not bring instability for us in the years ahead. Last challenge, and then I will talk about BMD, is the fact that since many years there is a drawdown in defense spending in Europe, and this in fact creates a very heterogeneous alliance. By the fact, if we put aside the United States, two countries, the UK and France, are able to deliver a certain amount of forces out of area, when the others, for obvious reasons, are no longer to deliver. And this is beginning to create a lot of problems within the alliance. Now let me talk about BMD. BMD, it may be good to have limited capabilities in terms of anti-missile defense. However, it raises a lot of issues which are far from being clarified. Let me give you some element of those problems. First, it's about the definition of what we want to achieve. Is it to deter a kind of Russian missile force? Is it about Iran? But what does that mean? Is it about what? So we need to clarify the purpose of a limited BMD. Second, there are a lot of technical implications behind the development of BMD. And to the understanding of many French analysts, Europe could not spend its meager research and development capability to see those limited capabilities to be aspired by the US industries, as it has been the case with the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Third element, sometimes we can think that BMD would be a system of systems conceived, built, and operate largely by the United States. And this is not in France at least, we see that as not being acceptable by the member of the European Union, member of NATO. Since the EU as an entity on the international scene may have its own interest in trade, in high-tech, in finance, which may not be totally coinciding with the United States. And at the same time that we are defending our interest in trade, finance, high-tech, we will put part of our defense under the control of the United States, which is at the same time a competitor in the domain I just mentioned. It would create contradiction within the EU that will not be acceptable. Fourth point, BMD could be an adjunct to nuclear deterrence. And for the French, Karl Heinz, nuclear deterrence has never been an exotic issue. It's central to our posture. It's central to our defense posture, as it is in the UK and as it is in the United States, due to the amount of money spent in the US, in the UK, or in France on those complex matters. So for us, BMD is just an adjunct to nuclear deterrence. And nuclear deterrence is the basic foundation of what means Article 5 for us. Without nuclear deterrence, there is no Article 5. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we go even further west and go to Steve Larrabee. Steve, could I ask you to bring a U.S. perspective into this, albeit not a government one? What are the U.S. concerns and the concerns you hear in Washington vis-a-vis the credibility of the alliance? I have to say there's been a lot of talk that I've heard, at least, about the U.S. not taking the leadership role that we always expect the U.S. to take when it comes to the Libyan operation. Do you see it that way? Is that a sign of disinterest in the alliance? Or is it just something else? One of the things that we talked about at a session last night was a diminishing of enthusiasm for the further enlargement of NATO. And I know that's something, Stanislaw Koziej mentioned Poland being on the edge of Europe. And maybe that wouldn't always be the case if there were further enlargements. But how do you see that? Is the golden age of NATO enlargement past, or will we see more in the future? And what's the U.S. attitude towards that?
Thank you very much. Let me first start, before I address Libya. Is it on? Yeah. Before I address Libya and the question of enlargement, to go back to the question of Article 5. I think, it is clear that Article 5 should remain as a fundamental pillar of NATO policy. Having said that, I still think we have to keep our eye and attention on how the strategic environment has changed. And if you ask yourself the type of threats that NATO and the Atlantic community, transatlantic community, are likely to face, they are obviously not the type of threat that NATO was initially set up to deter. That is, a large-scale conventional attack against the members. The type of threats, by and large, that we see today are coming from non-state actors rather than state, not exclusively, but primarily. They are transnational rather than national, and they are beyond Europe's borders rather than aimed at Europe. So that inevitably means that NATO and its members have to adapt to a very different security environment than they have faced in the past. It means that the type of forces that NATO has have to be able to deploy far from NATO's borders. They have to be sustained over longer periods of time. And that the basic attention of the alliance has to, and the focus of it has to change. And if you look at where the alliance is involved now, Afghanistan, Libya, this underscores how things have changed. And I do think that there has been probably a little bit too much concern about Article 5. I say it has to remain the fundamental principle, but we have to look at the strategic environment as it is and the way it has changed. We are likely to face, in my view, much more of a problem trying to deter against suitcase bombs than we are against necessarily a missile attack against one of our members. We are likely to face many more internal threats of a terrorist nature linked to entities from abroad than we are, again, an attack on a national state. So one shouldn't become overly preoccupied with the type of threats that we have faced for most of the time in the Cold War. Let me then turn to the question of Libya, because I think it is very important. If you had asked most people, even sitting here, whether NATO would be involved in Libya, even 2 or 3 years ago, people would have said, well, why would we ever get involved in something like that? And it's, for me, a reflection of how things have changed. Now, I know that in Europe, the decision by the United States to, as it seemed, let the Europeans or encourage the Europeans to do more is seen in some quarters in Europe as a reflection of a reduced American interest in NATO. I think this is completely false. I don't think it reflects that at all. It reflects a difference in the overall environment in which the United States has to operate. That is one which Yves rightly pointed out, is one in which the economic situation in the United States has changed. It reflects the fact that the United States, this administration, is still involved in two wars that it inherited from previous administration. And therefore, one has to ask what, from an American point of view, are American interests? Is it, the United States cannot continue to be engaged in 3 or 4 different conflicts at a time in which it's facing this type of an economic situation. But beyond that, the fact of the matter is that Libya is in North Africa. North Africa is an area which is of greater interest to a number of countries in Europe, and greater interest to Europe than probably it is in the United States. So therefore, I think one should look at the question of how the United States responded to Libya in this broader context, and recognize that the Europeans have rightly, I think, emphasized over the last decade, and particularly the last 5 years, that the alliance should be more balanced, that they were ready and wanted to take on more responsibility. And I think that the decision on how the United States would handle Libya reflected also that here was an opportunity for the Europeans to actually take on some responsibility. It didn't mean that the United States was not going to be involved. In fact, in the first stage, the United States was very strongly involved. But it was an effort then to let the leadership evolve, and for the Europeans to show that what they had always wanted to do, that they were capable of doing. And quite frankly, I think that the British and the French leadership in this has been quite good. The alliance is doing a reasonably good job under the circumstances. The circumstances are limited by the mandate, and therefore I disagree actually with Jim Jones. I don't think you can try to change the mandate. What one has to do is do what I think the British and French and the NATO is doing, which is to go beyond the mandate and recognize that strategically we have to get this conflict behind us. The sooner it is terminated, the better, and that the strategic goal is in fact regime change. That is not the mandate, but that's what I think we have to recognize.
Thanks very much. Well, we've gone from reassurance to regime change, which is quite a leap in one panel. I think what we've heard is that the reassurance desired in Poland and Latvia and elsewhere was largely produced. That desire was largely met. But we've opened a box with a whole bunch of other questions about the internal challenges that NATO faces, including financial ones. And which threats are now actually the most urgent? And how do we respond to those? And then there's the whole debate that Steve touched on but didn't quite deal with, which is how do you deal with a mandate change, and what should NATO be using its military forces to do? So I want to open it all to the audience now and invite you all to bring in both comments and questions for our panelists. Yes. Please say who you are.
Of course. My name is Paweł Orłowski. I work for Wirtualna Polska, and I've got a question to General Koziej, so I'll ask it in Polish. Panie generale, co Polska zrobi wobec nacisków sojuszników, jakie się pojawiają ostatnio,
as regards the pressures from alliance, as regards the Libya mission? Will government and the president, do they anticipate any change in the policy? Will Poland get involved into this NATO Libyan mission?
No ja trochę znajduję się w niezręcznej sytuacji wśród wszystkich panelistów, dlatego że
I find myself in a slightly awkward position as regards other panelists because I am on a very official, formal standing here, whether other people are quite unofficially here, but I will try to answer it logically without giving any open decision as regards the final decision. I have no idea what the final decision of the head of the state will be. However, I want to clarify the clue of our Polish approach to the Libya crisis and the decision that or the standing that we'll have or we have now. As you may know, Poland, since the very beginning, supported international operations aiming at changes, changing the regime in Libya, and so we supported the developments that take place in that region. So our support, we express it very clearly in political terms. We declare our openness to get involved financially and organizationally to transform the situation after the transformation that will have to be carried out in Libya. However, we do not participate in military efforts, military actions. It has some very defined conditions. The character of our involvement of Polish, we think that it's a very appropriate attitude. It is a result of our real assessment of our
Sądzimy zresztą, że każdy uczestnik jakiejkolwiek operacji międzynarodowej w ten sam sposób postępuje, to znaczy postępuje tak, jak podpowiadają mu interesy i możliwości. By daleko nie sięgać, odwołajmy się do samych Stanów Zjednoczonych, które przecież nie inaczej, a w wyniku oceny swoich interesów i możliwości przyjęły taką, nie inną strategię wobec Libii, że najpierw się zaangażowały, a teraz już się nie chcą angażować. To nie wynika z kaprysu, tylko to wynika z realnej oceny, o której tutaj była też już pośrednio mowa. Tak samo i Polska. My jesteśmy bardzo proporcjonalnie do naszych możliwości bardzo mocno zaangażowani w Afganistanie. Więc w zasadzie mamy dylemat jeden. Czy wycofywać się szybko z Afganistanu i angażować się w Libii, bo nie stać nas, aby jednocześnie prowadzić dwie duże operacje międzynarodowe, brać udział w dwóch dużych operacjach międzynarodowych w Afganistanie i w Libii. To jest tak, jak tutaj słyszeliśmy Stany Zjednoczone. One mają dwie swoje wojny. No przepraszam bardzo, dlaczego jeszcze mają w trzeciej w Libii uczestniczyć? Nie stać ich. Jeżeli Ameryki nie stać, no to Polski tym bardziej nie stać. Więc ja bym apelował, aby nie dziwić się takiemu, a nie innemu, takiej, a nie innej treści naszej decyzji wobec tego kryzysu. Uważam, że on ma pełne swoje uzasadnienie. Chcę tylko podkreślić może jedno, żeby dla uczestników tej dyskusji było jasne. Polska, angażując się w Afganistanie, wydaje rocznie na swoją operację w Afganistanie 20% całego budżetu na całe siły zbrojne przeznaczonego na modernizację techniczną. Co 5 lat osłabiamy swoje tempo modernizacji o 1 rok w stosunku do swoich sojuszników. Nie stać nas, aby równie takie koszty długo ponosić, ponieważ to by musiało oznaczać zahamowanie tempa modernizacji polskich sił zbrojnych, na co pozwolić sobie nie możemy z punktu widzenia naszych interesów strategicznych narodowych, ale też nie powinniśmy z punktu widzenia interesów całego NATO, bo siły zbrojne polskie są jednak ważnym elementem także NATO. Więc na dzisiaj nie widać przesłanek, aby ta decyzja mogła być zmieniona. Oczywiście ona może być zmieniona, jeśli by się pojawiły jakieś radykalnie inne przesłanki do podejmowania decyzji.
Just briefly about Libya operation, I want just to stress 2 points. One was that, if I remember correctly, during 15 days, it was a US operation, a British operation, and a French operation. The French being the first to act. And then the question was, what about EU operation? Why is this question? Because beside NATO, beside defense, we, as members of the European Union, which include all the EU members, we have stated that the south part of Mediterranean is our borders. So if we, Europeans, cannot act at our borders, what are we becoming? This is our borders. This is the borders of Poland, this is the borders of France, this is the border of England, etc. This is the south border of the European Union. And then dramatic events happen, and a few European countries were willing to act. And this raised a lot of questions, a question about the heterogeneity of NATO, and a question about the reframing of ESDP within a certain limited circle of countries going ahead in terms of developing ESDP.
Yes.
Just a quick point on that last comment, because I think that what General Jones said this morning about the fact that Libya, that these operations ultimately will be a civilian solution, and that this division between, let's not blur the distinctions, clearly where it's a military intervention is required, as was the case with the UN Security Council resolution, then NATO needs to get involved. I think the EU role then needs to come in later. I don't think an ESDP role for the military intervention would have been appropriate.
Didn't, in fact, the UN refuse to let the EU operation for humanitarian assistance move forward? I mean, that was my understanding, that at the end, although the EU authorized the mission, it was unable to take to the field. Karl Heinz.
Just the interesting twist to all this, because the question was whether Poland would have to get engaged more. And once again, I speak for my me being a German, basically always under threat. Although that reminds me, because you said that you are in an official mission here. Of course, I always have to emphasize that I do not speak for NATO. We all know that this is a Chatham House rule, but you all know the NATO version of the Chatham House rule, which is you can't be quoted, but you can be fired. But the interesting point is that maybe that those countries who did not contribute militarily to the operation, at the end of the day might have been happy if they would have done. Because if this Libya thing is over and it ends with the end we all expect and hope for, that Gaddafi is gone, in what way it might happen, then we are talking about the nation-building operations. You have a country which has no structures, no parties, no all the things you need for a functioning country. You might have a severe security problem when one side basically hunts for the other side, and so on. And when we talk about nation building, then we talk about many, many years. And we talk about about a huge amount of necessary resources. And I can perfectly understand that those 8 who have done the dirty job might say, now it's up to the others to do a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me bring in Julian Lindley-French, who's been very patient, and then Andrew and Kate.
I'll wait for a microphone. That's a Project. Project, absolutely. Julian Lindley-French of Chatham House. Speaking of Chatham House, I gave evidence to the House of Commons Defence Committee on Wednesday. And there were 2 central tenets to my evidence about British strategy, such as it is. One doesn't normally go to war by cutting defence budgets, because one doesn't tend to win. And second, that if one reads the UK's national security strategy, in the first chapter it describes a big, changing and dangerous world. In the second chapter, it cuts Britain's ability to influence it. Now, I might have been talking about the NATO strategic concept, and it's entirely appropriate that we come to these events and people talk about commitment, investment, strategy, and all the usual rubbish we hear at these events. Now, take the strategic concept. The key question surely be is if the document has validity as an analysis, how do we establish planning traction out of it as an alliance? Because it strikes me that by a year on from Lisbon, there'll be no planning traction. We retreat ever more into emasculated defence budgets. Security consumes defence as we focus ever more on domestic issues. And yet we go on with this almost false strategic reassurance that somehow there is essence to what we're doing. So my simple question to the panel is not about how many bombs are dropping on Libya, etc., etc. How do we re-establish that basic linkage between what we say we're going to do as an alliance, or indeed as a union, and our willingness and preparedness to invest in it?
Andy, is this in the same line?
Yeah, just 2 fingers on this that I wanted to add. Just as we were
Say who you are.
Andrew Mikta, GMF Warsaw Office Director. My friend here, Michał Baranowski, handed me a tablet that was showing the report from Gates' speech in Brussels, where he basically said that the future of the alliance is quite dim unless the allies finally, once and for all, resource defense. My question, following to what Julian was saying, to the whole panel is that while we talk about the strategic concept, we're not really talking about how to actually transition out of the Lisbon summit with the Lisbon Critical Capabilities Commitment and do something very specific, which is on everybody's agenda here right now, I think, or at least it should be, which is how to wind down Afghanistan. And what's in the capabilities commitment is something that could actually be used very specifically to deliver that operation and allow the alliance to walk away from what is a dismal situation in the long run, I think. I mean, you can't win much over there. You have to agree on some way of resolving the crisis, but walking away from it in one piece as an alliance, or there will not be a NATO 0.20, I would submit to the panel into the future, simply because the US Congress will say enough. Will say enough of maintaining a wonderful set of freeways and terrific food, and I'm not dissing anybody here, but at the same time when our own country needs investment. So if the alliance has traction, show me the money. And we have a campaign during which we need to deliver a collective outcome. We have a blueprint in the NATO new strategic concept, and we have, in effect, also a pathway to apply what's in that capabilities commitment to a current operation that is critical for us all to do collectively. Why don't we do that?
Thank you. Let me bring in at least one other voice, Kate Hansen-Bond.
Boże, to było straszne.
Okay, thank you. I'm the head of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and we are with you in Libya. I just mentioned that. Stephen Larrabee got a question about enlargement, future enlargements. We have been listening to the financial problems in the alliance and in the European Union as well. Is it the austerity? Is it the economic problems? who will harm future enlargement, or is it a lack of political will inside a very diversified alliance?
Steve, go ahead and give it a first shot, but I also, if you want to make comments on, I think, generally the question of how do you, or is it possible to resource this alliance in a credible way?
Let me first go to the question of enlargement. I don't think it's a question of resources particularly, nor, quite frankly, of lack of will. The strategic environment has changed. It's quite different. How can you consider seriously bringing in Ukraine at a time when the Ukrainian government says it doesn't want to be a member, and that it is not. Now, you could say, well, the Ukrainian government doesn't necessarily represent all Ukrainians, and that's certainly true, but as long as you have a government that is unwilling to, doesn't really want to become a member, it's going to be very hard. So the whole issue of enlargement has been put on hold. But I would also say that as I say, the strategic context in which enlargement was taking place has changed. If you look at the situation when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic came in, that was at a time when, let's face it, when when Russia was weak. If you look at the qualifications of the aspirants, they were certainly far better than the potential aspirants in the post-Soviet space. If you look at the question of, well, I will call it identity, there may have been opposition to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joining, but no one really thought that they weren't European countries. Now, there are a lot of Europeans who don't think Ukraine and Georgia are necessarily European countries, and my wife, who's a Hungarian, happens to be one of them. It's not my view. But as long as you have a sizable portion of the population of Europe questioning that, you have a very difficult situation. Then again, in the first round, the United States had an important partner, the Federal Republic of Germany, which was willing and able to get out in front and really work with the United States and spearhead the European part of the enlargement process. We don't have that type of a partner today. Now, I'm not blaming him. I'm just saying the context has really changed. And of course, from the Russian point of view, we are dealing with with countries that were a part of the Soviet Empire, and in many cases also originally part of the Russian Empire as well. So the whole context is very different. And I think for the time being, the whole issue of enlargement is really is on hold and is likely to remain there for a longer time. That I still think the door should be kept open, but we should be realistic about the possibilities for anyone to walk through it. Now, let me just come to Julian's question. There are only two ways you can do this. Either, if you don't have the money, then you have to cut back the commitments. Or if you want to keep the commitments, then you'll have to devote more money to it. And it comes down to that however you want to do it, however you slice it.
Let me first say that Steve has succeeded in having all the panelists indicate to me that they want to speak. But first I want to bring in... yes, absolutely. But first I'd like to bring in Janusz Januszkiewicz.
He wouldn't have spoken either.
I would like to return to the issue of Libya. Steve Larrabee quite rightly said that, in fact, what we are after now goes far beyond the mandate, because we clearly stated that we are after the regime change. But if we are going to proceed, are there any chances that we could get a mandate of UN for that? I really doubt it. I really doubt it. I would even say I'm absolutely certain we will not be given this mandate. So I'm afraid that we are in a situation when we really have to face a certain stalemate. Because if we look at this present situation, we can see that insurgents simply are too weak, even with all our support, to topple Gaddafi. And Gaddafi is fortunately too weak to somehow regain the control over the country. So my question is, having in mind that, and assuming that we will not put our boots on the ground, and that African Union nor Arab Union would do the same thing, they wouldn't do the same thing, how we are going to sort of solve this problem? What are the future? Could you look into your crystal ball and tell us, how do you see the whole situation evolving? Thank you.
Let me go to General Koziej and ask if this rather gloomy portrait here has made him more or less willing to countenance Polish involvement in Libya, but also there has been this talk about that there are only 8 alliance members actually involved. Are we heading to a place where we have some alliance members involved in Operation X, some in Operation Y? They kind of do it because, we're friends, we're going to help each other out that way, rather than seeing that all this is in our interests. When you think...
The same aims to be involved in Operation X and the same aims to be involved in Operation Y, but nobody else is.
But I would say that in the case of Afghanistan, the U.S. has taken the lead, and many, at least in the European public, say that we're doing it because the Americans asked us to, okay? And in Libya, the French and others have seen this as definitely in their interests, and the Americans are kind of saying, our allies asked us to do this. Is this a way to run an alliance? So that's kind of, are you more eager to get involved or not? And speak on enlargement as well, because we're going to have quick comments because we're going to have to bring this to a head in about 5 to 10 minutes.
I think that this is a totally normal situation that we observe at the moment, meaning that it's a behavior from NATO which is required by circumstances. My thesis is that the main dilemma of NATO today is getting adapted to a completely changed circumstances and possibilities. NATO reacts as consensus. When there was a Cold War, everything was clear, everybody was impacted on it, consensus was absolutely clear because everybody agreed that we have to be protected because we are all under the same risk. Today risks in contemporary world have totally different dimensions and character. They are selective. These are selective risks. So ones are impacted very strongly and others only in insignificant way. Some are not impacted at all. Therefore, it's difficult to get a consensus. Therefore, I'm not surprised that NATO operates in this way, that some countries, some states that are directly influenced by a certain situation, just as Libya is directly, or Spain or Italy is directly related to Libya. Therefore, they get more involved, whereas other countries which have more distant interests are less willing to get involved. And that has to be taken into consideration in the strategy and the way NATO operates. We should not be surprised and not require everybody forcefully that everybody gets involved with equal force.
Ale co chciałem na koniec powiedzieć? Uważam, że trzeba wrócić do tego pytania i tematu podstawowego naszego panelu, jakim jest artykuł 5. Ja myślę, że każde państwo, na przykład Polska, może dużo większą swobodą angażować się w wszelkie operacje międzynarodowe, zagraniczne, gdzieś daleko od swojego terytorium, tym bardziej będzie mogła się angażować i mocniej będzie wierzyła, że ma zapewnione bezpieczeństwo swojego terytorium, swojego kraju. Więc albo gwarancje NATO będą w sprawie artykułu 5 tak mocne, jednoznaczne, że nie pozostawiają wątpliwości, w związku z tym bez żadnej obawy i jedziemy na jakieś misje gdzieś daleko od kraju, albo jeśli nie, to niestety my musimy swój priorytet swoich wysiłków obronnych ulokować w rozwijaniu, umacnianiu własnego potencjału obronnego, własnych sił zbrojnych. Nie możemy trwonić swoich zasobów finansowych ograniczonych, jak u każdego, na jakieś zadania pośrednie, jeśli nie zapewnimy bezpieczeństwa swojego kraju. Więc albo gwarancje artykułu 5 będą tak mocne, że nie będą pozostawiać wątpliwości, aby dać swobodę każdemu angażować się i wtedy NATO będzie mogło działać całością, albo przyjmujemy zasadę, że każdy w pierwszej kolejności troszczy się o siebie i dopiero później angażuje się w inne zadania. Kończąc, uważam, że podstawą skuteczności NATO w operacjach wszelkich, w tym w operacjach odległych gdzieś w całym świecie, jest artykuł 5. On daje poczucie pewności i możliwość swobodnego operowania przy innych zadaniach.
Yeah, it will be a few words of the comment. Jerzy Dereń, Lower Silesia University, a former NATO strategic planner, so I spent 4 years in the shape looking for requirement, giving the task as a force goes, later on looking for it as an exemplification on the ground with the NATO Rapid Reaction Corps in Istanbul. So it's very difficult. Joining my British and American friends, of course, the Article 5 credibility is a capability driven. However, since the revolution in military affairs became as a momentum for the NATO from the US through the Allied Command transformation, we have only the 2 ways of a strategic planning. The threat-oriented, as a general professor said, the threat-oriented is so complex because today we cannot use Lancaster rules, and even it is impossible to describe in the modeling simulation the threat because, General, you said, 5 days later, no threat. 1 year later, maybe, but maybe, nobody knows. And the second one is effect-based approach for operation planning. So we have a scenario, the most probably a sophisticated scenario, and also we should use American expression from the Rand Corporation with a toolbox of capabilities which allow us to defeat, to face such kind of the scenario. So I think that credibility, Article 5, credibility is a capability, but the capability are seen as, for example, the massive division of the tanks. It's a waste of time and a waste of money. So I think that mobile, technologically skilled forces, it is a future. And also expeditionary forces. This is only one way for the NATO credibility. So I support your point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me bring in Imants Liegis. I know he wants to say something about enlargement. And since Latvia is also involved in Afghanistan, let me ask one possibility that was presented by Andrew Miktar was that we, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing you the wrong way, Andrew, but kind of declare victory and leave as a budgetary measure. Okay. How would you feel about that? Is it time to start thinking about really seriously winding down Afghanistan?
This is what I was asked when I was Minister of Defence by the mothers of one of our soldiers, when are we leaving Afghanistan? And it was very difficult to give a straight answer. But I think the answer has now been given to a certain extent. I mean, okay, we have to bear in mind the fact that it has to be driven by the situation on the ground and not fixate with a date, but at the same time, the date has been set out by President Karzai, 2014, on the basis that they have been able to take on the responsibility for the majority of their own security, both in the police and the armed forces. I didn't want to speak about enlargement, Fran, but I do want to say a couple of other words of comments. resourcing in the alliance, which is very important. I mean, this is a priority. It's a question of prioritizing. The wolf is at the door, you know, as we heard this morning. I had to make very difficult decisions. Do we retain our engagement in Afghanistan, you know, a couple of years ago when I was minister, or do we substantially cut down from NATO response force? Obviously, we retained our commitment of 175 soldiers, Latvian soldiers, in Afghanistan as our contribution to the alliance as a quid pro quo to sort of having air policing, etc. So these are very hard decisions, but they have to be made in the light of the solidarity that we receive. On the question of clearly the strategic situation and the context has changed. There's a parallel conference taking place in Tallinn these days, 300 people attending, discussing cyber terrorism, cyber attacks. Will that become part of an Article 5 situation? The US is highlighting this situation. Estonia, you know, what are they offering in this? They have a centre of excellence in Tallinn following the 2007 cyber attacks. So this is their contribution. Small countries can make, you know, appropriate contributions to the alliance. And I would say that looking at the the strategic context has changed, but no. Ask that to a Georgian. Georgia is not a member of, they are candidate members of NATO. 3 years ago, they were militarily invaded by their neighbor on the pretext of Russian nationals needing to be defended. So, you know, the old situation is still out there to a certain extent. People on the streets of Riga after the war in Georgia were saying to me, does Article 5 mean anything to Latvia? You know, I said, well, we're in NATO, Georgia isn't. So, but those situations, we have Iskander rockets on the borders of NATO in northeastern Europe. You know, so does that mean that the strategic context has changed? So those would be, and two final comments. We don't want a two-speed NATO, and we don't want the renationalization of defense and security.
Let me bring in Yves Boyer.
Yes, thank you. First, some points about Libya. I mean, the game is almost over, and so it's not necessary to talk about newcomers to the military operation. But just I want to emphasize that if we don't have a move on Libya, Libya could have become, in fact, a kind of Somalia at the south border of Europe, a partition, Cyrenaic, Tripolitan, Feza, with the development of all type of nasty trade, the development of the extension of ACMI, Al-Qaeda du Maghreb Islamique, coming from Niger to Somalia, and it would have posed a real threat for us, we in the European Union, plus the issue of mass migration. Shall I remind you that Africa is doubling its population in 20 years, and those people who come through Libya now will not stop in Italy or in France or in Spain. They will go in your country. So we can absorb a certain amount of this type of people, but too much is too much. So we are all concerned by what is happening in Libya. And again, this is the southern border of the European Union. Second remarks about what could we do in this 2 or 3 tier NATO. In fact, there is very few options. One is to side more and more with the United States. For certain countries, it will mean a total dependency on defense affairs. On countries like the UK and France, it will mean a cooperation with the US, which is slightly different. The only solution is to develop a European defense policy. And I am sorry to say so, but we have all signed the Maastricht Treaty and the other treaty after the Maastricht Treaty. And in this treaty, in those treaties, it is expressly said that we will have to develop a common European defense policy. This is written, and we have to do so. And I am sorry, Iman, but I don't accept the division of labor, NATO, military affairs, EU, soft security. No, it's not what is written in the text. We all together sign and ratified. We have to develop a European defense policy that may be the only way to overcome the scarcity of resources that we will devote to defense.
Thank you. And a final word from Karl Heinz.
Well, thank you. Just 2 minutes on the financial issue, because I think this is key. I don't want to belittle the financial problems. Yes, the situation is really bad. More and more countries come under 1% of their GDP spending. That's why all this nice talk about missile defense are really cute. I don't know who's going to pay this. We have every day a new package for Greece with figures I cannot even pronounce. So we have no imagination. The point of all this, though, is that these doom and gloom speeches of Gates, they just don't help because you don't get the money. So if his logic is, if NATO doesn't spend more money, then NATO is dead, then NATO is dead. However, I believe that there are at least 2 factors which at least give a slight positive sign. The first one is that financial cuts, and it might sound funny, they always are a chance. We see it in Germany. We have a German defense reform. It's necessary for 2 decades now. We never did it. Now we do, simply because we cannot pay it anymore. And the second positive thing is the situation in Afghanistan. NATO went to Afghanistan with the same financial problems, or also strong financial problems, no consensus, we didn't know what to achieve, and NATO is now there for 9 years, which is 50% more than the Second World War took. This is for me a high sign of solidarity and of the ability to do something if it's really necessary. So probably these are the 2 avenues where we should go.
Well, I want to thank the panel. It is time for us to bring this to an end. I think we've traveled a great distance. We have, I think, reached consensus that Article 5 is pretty credible, but that there are a whole host of other issues and challenges, as Yves would put it, within the alliance, such as the finances, which we all came back to, which seems to actually drive discussions across the Atlantic now on a whole host of issues. So I'd like to thank the panel, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming. And hopefully this is a discussion that we can continue over lunch upstairs before reconvening in the large conference room. Thank you very much.